Standing on the porch that night, I watched my own son turn the deadbolt on me. The sound of that lock sliding into place cut deeper than any words could. 12 years of raising him, of sacrifices no one else would ever know. And now, I was standing outside in the dark. Nothing but 2 suitcases at my feet. It felt like being discarded with the trash, like all the years of love and loyalty had suddenly expired. I didn't cry, at least not right then. The sting was sharp, yes, but beneath it was something stronger, something that surprised even me. I realized I was staring at the lowest point of my life, and at the same time, I was staring at the very beginning of something no one in that house could have imagined. They thought they had rid themselves of a burden. What they didn't know was that the woman they shoved out into the rain would one day stand at the top of a staircase in a mansion worth millions, looking down on the very people who once looked down on her. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how being thrown away can become the fuel for a fire you didn't know was still inside you. My name is Margaret, and this is how I went from being unwanted and homeless to building a life so extraordinary. Even I sometimes have to remind myself it's real. And it all started the night my own son locked me out. When my husband passed away, I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. 43 years of marriage gone in a quiet hospital room, leaving me with memories, a handful of insurance money, and a silence that pressed in on every corner of our old house. I wasn't ready to face that silence alone. So when my son, David, and his wife, Laura, invited me to stay with them for a while, I believed it was an act of kindness. I told myself it was what family was supposed to do, help each other through the hardest storms. At first, I tried to make myself useful. I used the small checks from Social Security to cover groceries and bills. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, and picked the kids up from school. I thought I was easing their burdens. But slowly, I began to see the cracks. Laura's polite smiles carried an edge I couldn't ignore. She had a way of sighing when I asked harmless questions, of rolling her eyes just enough that I could feel the sting without hearing the words. David never defended me. He was my only child, the boy I had worked double shifts for, the one I raised alone when his father worked nights. Now, in that house, I felt him slipping away. He sat quietly at the dinner table when Laura dismissed my cooking as old-fashioned. He looked down at his plate when she insisted the children were confused about who was really in charge. My presence, once meant to help, had become an inconvenience they endured. The morning everything changed was unremarkable at first. The October air was damp, carrying that heavy grayness that seeps into your bones. I remember setting my coffee on their perfect granite countertop, the one I had helped them pay for. That was when Laura said, in her usual clipped tone, that the arrangement wasn't working anymore. She wanted her home back, free from my ways, my voice, my presence. I waited for David to stop her, to tell her that I was his mother, that we would figure things out. Instead, he avoided my eyes. He muttered something about stress, about needing space. His hands trembled as he carried my suitcase's 2 old bags that barely held a lifetime of memories to the porch. And then he shut the door. The first raindrops fell as I stood there, staring at the house I had once imagined would always hold me. My clothes clung to my skin, my hair plastered to my face. I should have felt anger, but in that moment, I felt nothing but hollow disbelief. It was as if I had become invisible, a stranger dropped at the curb. The laughter of my grandchildren echoed faintly through the windows, a cruel reminder of what I was losing. And yet, standing in that rain, shivering with humiliation, something inside me began to stir. The woman they thought they were discarding was not as fragile as they believed. Beneath the heartbreak, a small ember of strength flickered to life. I didn't know how or when, but I felt a quiet promise forming. This would not be the final chapter of my story. That night, with only $800 tucked into my purse and nowhere to go, I climbed into a taxi without looking back. Not because I felt strong, but because I had no other choice. What I didn't realize then was that the rain soaking through my dress would become the water that helped something entirely new grow inside me. And that is where the struggle truly began. The taxi dropped me off at a roadside motel, the kind of place people use when they have nowhere else to turn. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a tired glow across cracked pavement. I paid for the room in cash, $43 a night, and carried my suitcases into a space that smelled of bleach and broken dreams. The carpet was thin, the bed sagged, and the air conditioner wheezed like it was taking its last breath. Still, it had a lock on the door, and for the first time that day, I let myself crumble. Those first mornings were the hardest. I would wake up thinking I was still in my old home, only to be reminded by the stale air and the narrow bed that I had been pushed aside. Loneliness sat heavy on my chest. I had no family breakfasts to prepare, no grandchildren to hear laughing in the next room. Just silence, the kind that gnaws at you until even the smallest sound, a dripping faucet, a passing car, feels deafening. I tried to pull myself together and search for work. Every morning, I walked to the public library where the internet was free. I filled out application after application, clicking submit until the words blurred on the screen. But the responses, when they came at all, were painfully predictable. Too old. Too much experience in the wrong things. Too slow for what companies wanted. At 60, I had suddenly become invisible to the working world. Each rejection chipped away at what little dignity I still had. It was the motel clerk, a kind, older man named Mr. Patterson, who noticed my struggle. One night, when I came back drenched from a sudden storm, he slid an extra towel across the counter without a word. It was such a small thing, but I felt my throat tighten. Sometimes it isn't grand gestures that keep you alive. It's the quiet reminder that you're still seen. 6 weeks later, when my savings had thinned to almost nothing, a stroke of grace appeared. I interviewed at a small garden center run by a woman close to my age. She didn't seem impressed by my resume at first, but when I explained I had done bookkeeping for my late husband's contracting business, she gave me a chance. $15 an hour, part-time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to breathe again. The work was simple invoices, receipts, balancing accounts, but what caught my eye were the plants lined up out back. Rows of withered leaves, browned stems, and pots tagged for disposal. I asked about them, and the owner shrugged. "They're dead," she said. "We throw them away at the end of each season." Yet, as I looked closer, I saw something different. They weren't dead, they were neglected, dormant, waiting for care. In their fragile stems, I saw a reflection of myself, tossed aside, assumed worthless, but still alive underneath. That realization struck me like a spark in the dark. For the first time in months, I felt a surge of possibility. If these plants could be brought back with attention and patience, maybe I could too. What began as bookkeeping was about to grow into something far greater. And that spark, small, almost invisible, was the beginning of my rebirth. I carried home the first few dead plants in cardboard boxes the garden center owner let me take, probably expecting they'd end up in the trash anyway. My motel room had been replaced by a small studio apartment above a pizza shop, and soon every corner of it smelled of damp soil. I lined the windowsills with cracked pots, propped drooping stems against chipped mugs, and spent late nights reading library books about plant care. At first, most of them looked hopeless. Leaves curled, stems brittle, roots packed tight in dry soil. But I couldn't help myself. I watered carefully, trimmed the dead growth, whispered encouragement as if they could hear me. Something about their fragility made me feel less alone. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Chen downstairs frowned each time she saw me lugging another pot up the narrow staircase. "Too many plants," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Some people whispered that I was eccentric, wasting time on things that would never come back. I didn't argue. Let them think I was crazy. For the first time since being thrown out, I had something that gave me purpose. Months passed, and then the miracle happened. One by one, little green shoots began to appear. Brown stems softened, leaves unfurled. The sight of new growth felt like a resurrection, not just for the plants, but for me. I had been tossed aside just like them, assumed finished. But under the right care, I was still alive, still capable of blooming. By February, my apartment had turned into a jungle. Over 200 plants crowded every available space. When I brought the first batch back to the garden center, the owner's eyes widened. They were healthier than the ones she had originally sold. She bought them back for half the original retail price. And in that single transaction, I earned more than my first month's salary. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about dignity. It was about proof. Proof that I could still create value, that what others called worthless could still thrive under the right hands. That night, I sat in my tiny kitchen with a cup of instant coffee and smiled for the first time in months. I felt something returning to me: independence, confidence, a spark of joy I thought had been buried forever. The plants became my teachers. They reminded me that resilience is often quiet, that healing takes patience, and that even when cut back, life has a way of pushing through the soil again. I no longer felt like a burden or an outcast. I felt like a woman rediscovering her strength. And with every leaf that opened, I began to believe there might be more waiting for me beyond that cramped apartment. Because if I could breathe life into what the world had given up on, then maybe I could do the same for myself. And that was when the idea of something bigger began to take root. The moment I sold those first revived plants back to the garden center, I knew I had stumbled onto something bigger than just a hobby. What began as a way to fill the silence of my apartment slowly turned into an obsession, and then into a system. I kept notebooks full of experiments, different soils, watering schedules, pruning methods. Before long, I could tell at a glance what a plant needed, and word began to spread. Other garden centers called, asking if I would take their unsold inventory too. It didn't take long before my little apartment was bursting at the seams. The windowsills were crowded, the floors lined with pots. Even the pizza shop owner downstairs finally asked me, half joking, half serious, if I was starting a jungle above his restaurant. That was when I realized I couldn't keep going like this. If I wanted to take this further, I needed space. I needed help. That's when Eleanor came into my life. She worked at the Small Business Development Center, sharp as a blade and practical to the core. I showed her my ledgers, the sales I had been making, and the waiting list of shops that wanted my plants. She leaned back in her chair, tapped her pen, and told me what no one else had dared to say. You're not just reviving plants. You're turning waste into profit. That's a business. Her words unlocked something in me. I wasn't just a widow tinkering with greenery. I was solving a problem, one that garden centers everywhere struggled with. Eleanor pushed me to formalize it. We drafted a business plan together, line by line, until it became clear that this wasn't just an idea. It was a future. The hardest part was the loan. I sat in a banker's office with trembling hands, explaining how a 60-year-old woman who had once lived in a motel was now asking for $15,000 to rent a warehouse and hire staff. The loan officer raised an eyebrow. Skeptical. I don't blame him, but I told him the truth 3 years ago. I had less than $1,000 to my name. Last year, I turned what others considered trash into $2,000 in revenue. I know how to make value where others see none, I said. And for once, someone listened. The loan was approved. I'll never forget the day I signed the lease on that first warehouse. 5,000 square feet of empty concrete and dust, waiting to be filled with life. I hired 2 part-timers, bought proper equipment, and painted the name on the front door, Phoenix Plant Recovery. Because like me, everything deserves a second chance. The years that followed were a blur of long days and steady growth. By year 5, I had contracts with multiple states, dozens of licensed operators, and even Home Depot knocking on my door. Every time a new contract was signed, every time a withered plant came back to life, I felt that same surge of pride, not just because of the business, but because of what it meant I was standing on my own feet again. And it wasn't just work. For the first time in years, I had a community. Eleanor became a close friend. I joined a book club, laughed over wine, built friendships not born out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. I felt whole again, piece by piece. But the true turning point, the one that made me realize how far I had come, was the house. I hadn't been looking for revenge, not consciously. But when my realtor showed me the listing for the Harrison estate, the most expensive home in Millbrook Heights, I couldn't ignore it. 12,000 square feet of polished history, the crown jewel of the very neighborhood David and Laura had always fantasized about. They used to drive through those streets on Sundays, pointing at houses they could never afford. And now, I could. I walked through those grand hallways, ran my hand along the mahogany banisters, and looked out at the manicured lawns. From the master suite, you could see the whole town, including the modest neighborhood where my son and his wife still lived. I didn't hesitate. I made a cash offer, $3.8 million, when the keys were finally in my hand. I stood in the marble foyer and laughed quietly to myself. The woman they threw out with 2 suitcases now owned the mansion they had once dreamed of. It wasn't just a home. It was proof. Proof that I was never the burden they claimed I was. Proof that the discarded can rise higher than anyone dares to imagine. But I knew this triumph was only the beginning. Because the past has a way of showing up at your front door. And soon enough, mine did. It didn't take long after the deed to my new home hit the paper. Barely 24 hours later. The doorbell rang. On the security monitor, I saw them, David, Laura, and the children I had not been allowed to see in years. They stood on my porch like polite visitors, as though nothing had happened. I opened the door just enough to let my voice through. They told me they had come to reconnect, to start over, but I could see it in their eyes. This was not about reconciliation. This was about survival. Their mortgage was crumbling. David had lost his job, and Laura's spending habits had bled them dry. Now, suddenly, they remembered I was family. I invited them into the foyer, not out of warmth, but because I wanted them to see it. The marble floors, the high ceilings, the house they had once only dreamed of. Their words tumbled over each other, apologies laced with excuses. They called me strong, independent, resilient, words they had never used before. But beneath the flattery was desperation. I stayed calm. I reminded them of the day they set my suitcases on the porch and closed the door in my face. I told them how they drove by the motel every day for months, never once stopping to check on me. And then, I pulled out the letter, the one David had written years earlier, confessing his regret, begging me not to tell Laura. Watching Laura's face as I read those words aloud was the purest truth-telling I had ever done. The children stood frozen, confusion turning to anger as the lies unraveled. My granddaughter whispered that she barely remembered me because of those lost years. My grandson asked why they had been told I had abandoned them. They looked at me with tears in their eyes, and in that moment, I made a choice. I told them my door would always be open to them, but not to their parents. Laura's mask cracked into fury, and David sat pale with shame. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I simply drew the line that should have been drawn long ago. They had chosen convenience over compassion once. I wasn't going to let them choose my worth ever again. As they left, the children lingered, hugging me tightly, whispering that they wanted to come back. I promised them they could. And when the door finally closed, I stood in the quiet of my mansion, not with bitterness, but with the steady peace of justice served. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, it's a life lived well beyond what anyone thought you could achieve. Some victories are loud shouted from rooftops, celebrated with fireworks. Mine was quiet. It was sipping coffee from fine china in the morning light, looking out over acres of land that now belonged to me. It was hearing laughter again, this time from grandchildren who chose to know me despite the lies they were fed. It was the silence of peace after years of being told I was too much, too old, too set in my ways. What I've learned is simple but powerful. Being discarded doesn't mean you are worthless. Sometimes it means you've been given space to grow, to root yourself deeper, to bloom in ways no one expected. What others call broken or finished can be the very thing that carries you to freedom. I was thrown away like I didn't matter, but it was in that rejection that I found myself again. And now, I stand as proof that no one else gets to define your value. You do. So, if you've ever felt cast aside, if you've ever been told your time has passed, I want you to hear this. You are not finished. You are waiting to rise. This is my story, but now I'd love to hear yours. Share it in the comments. Let others know what you've overcome, how you've turned pain into power. And if this story touched you, please like and share it, because someone out there may need the reminder that even in the darkest moments, growth is still possible.